Falleció el comandante en jefe de la Revolución Cubana.
Revolutionary idealist dictator Fidel Castro, the controversial Cuban leader, has died.
Cuba y líder de la Revolución Cubana, Fidel Castro, ha muerto
Fidel Castro's influence will endure for generations to come.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. The final chapter of the Fidel Castro story. We'll look at the version coming out of Cuba, the one coming out of the U.S.
In Miami this evening, celebrations in the streets.
And we'll give the final word to the cartoonists. The new surveillance law that is a concern for British journalists, if not for their employers. Terminology watch, alt-right. What does that mean, and how should journalists use it? And the Moroccan television channel that offered makeup hints to brush over evidence of domestic violence. When news broke in Cuba of Fidel Castro's death, editors across the globe started publishing obituaries that had been decades in the writing. At 90, the revolutionary outlived many of his enemies, especially when one considers all those assassination attempts, more than 600, according to the Cubans. During his 47 years as leader, the country suffered economically under the American trade embargo, but punched above its weight politically. No other Caribbean island came close to having the kind of influence abroad that Cuba has had. Castro's involvement in liberation struggles across Africa, including Angola and South Africa, has not been forgotten there. His outright defiance of Washington was an inspiration to some, his cozy Cold War relationship with the Soviets a concern to others, which is why Fidel Castro in death, as in life, has been such a complex figure for journalists to cover. And it explains why news consumers, particularly in the United States, got such varied accounts. In Cuba, the coverage lionized the man, evidence to many of a fawning media that could only fit comfortably under a dictatorship. But like all things Castro, the story isn't that simple. Our starting point this week is the Cuban capital, Havana.
A las 10:29 horas de la noche, falleció el comandante en jefe de la Revolución Cubana, Fidel Castro Ruz. Cumplimiento de la voluntad expresa.
Era de esperar que Granma.
It was predictable that Granma, the official newspaper of the Communist Party and the official voice of the Central Committee, would publish such a glorifying cover on Fidel Castro. What does Cuba is Fidel mean? It's a recognition that Fidel Castro's main contribution to Cuba was national sovereignty. That's why they say Cuba is Fidel.
Por eso dicen Cuba es Fidel.
Y era una representación clara.
The message countered speculation abroad that the day he died, Cuba will change. That the only reason the revolution was still active was because Fidel was still alive. The headline said the opposite will happen, that Fidel is a symbol of Cuba.
Va a asumir a Fidel como su propio concepto.
TV news anchors on Sunday didn't realize that they were already on the air. And they usually start the day by saying buenos dias. And one of the anchors turns to the other and he says, isn't it silly that we can't say good day?
Es una grosería. Es una grosería.
Because it's not a good day. Fidel is dead, and so you cannot say good day.
That Cuban journalists were cautious with their words, even something like a simple greeting, is understandable and indicative, given the control their government has wielded over the news media.
Is it appropriate for the leader of the free world to offer condolences of a brutal dictator who killed his own people as well as Americans?
The U.S. media had no such concerns. Cuba has long been treated by American editors with suspicion and hostility. The obituaries they produced tend to dwell on Cuba's political prisoners, relatively few in number, while avoiding any mention of all the prisoners at Guantanamo Bay who happen to be on the very same island. U.S. media coverage of Cuba has softened along with the rapprochement initiated by the Obama White House last year. Until then, the tone was belligerent, often led by media outlets in Florida, news organizations catering to and often employing Cubans who had fled the island and its suffering economy for the U.S., the country that crippled Cuba's economy with a trade embargo that is now more than 50 years old.
We have over 1 million Cubans who have fled their homeland because of repression. In the early days, one could argue, well, they were members of the ruling party that was corrupt. But what happened is with each year, ordinary, regular people started to leave Cuba. Now, if you leave your country and you're told upon leaving that you can only leave with a little bag, you can't bring any money, you're leaving your home, you're walking out with the clothes on your back, basically. Those people are going to be quite embittered upon arrival in the United States. So does that influence the media? You bet it does.
Generalizing the North American media is difficult. US news outlets with a lot of Cuban influence, like the Miami Herald, played a decisive role in demonizing Cuba. But the New York Times, say, has played an important role in facilitating the US-Cuba rapprochement with the red carpet of editorials that led to Obama going to Havana. So there has been a shift. The country is covered more objectively than the one described during the Cold War.
You know, we were talking this morning, this is very personal, your parents fled, but...
Cuban Americans are not the only ones shaped by their experiences. Everyone is.
And I can remember night after night with my family, stuffing envelopes, greeting cards with medicines, Kool-Aid, just so they could have calories.
Fidel Castro's approach to the news media goes all the way back to 1954 and a coup d'etat in Guatemala. Castro was in a Cuban jail at the time, but his fellow revolutionary, Che Guevara, was there, watching it all unfold, a coup supported by Washington and backed by the US media. Che would conclude, as would Castro, that if they ever took Cuba, they could not afford what Americans like to call a free media.
Fidel watched very carefully what happened in Guatemala. Fidel Castro was very mindful of what was then America's Bigfoot imperialism in Latin America, how they could come in and just quash things. And he was also very wary of what a free democratic press can do.
That became a paradigm for Che Guevara and the way that he saw the media. And for both Che Guevara and Fidel Castro, there is actually no such thing as freedom of the press in the Western world, but freedom of business. Because for them, media just report what the media owners want them to. And it was from that moment, at the beginning of the revolution, that the media war with the US began.
When Che Guevara made those comments about the need to crush the press if the revolution was to survive, I think it was absolutely right. And it's absolutely necessary for an authoritarian government to control all of the media. And in this case, it wasn't just the media, it was all the information, because remember, Cuba's an island. And so the arrival and departure of news was also to be controlled.
Lenin
famously said that before having a political party, you need to own a newspaper. And I think what Che said about how important media are for the consolidation of power is right. The media were indeed one of the most important weapons of the revolution in order to consolidate power. However, the media's objectives are not the same anymore. Today, Cuba no longer faces the same level of aggression as it did in 1959.
Sometimes when revolutionaries take power, they can take it too far. So much has changed over the almost 6 decades that Fidel and then his brother Raúl have ruled. But the repression of the Cuban media remains largely in place. And journalists there, even those sympathetic to the Castros, may be afraid to tell you this on the record, but many of them are saying, basta, enough. The man has passed, and the time has come to revolutionize or re-revolutionize Cuba's media.
On the download now, our viewers on the coverage of the death of Fidel Castro.
Much of the coverage in South Africa has in fact focused on his legacy as an African anti-apartheid supporter, as someone who supported liberation movements all across the continent. Cuba continues to provide assistance to countries like South Africa, like the doctor exchange program. So more so than most countries in the world, I'd say, the coverage of Castro's passing has been very sad. It's been very respectful, and people have focused on that aspect of his legacy rather than perhaps the conditions of Cuba and the lack of freedoms and all of that.
The private media, however, nearly ignore Castro, with no highlighting at all, maybe expressing the normal view and feelings of the ordinary Angolans, and clearly showing that they now see history differently from the official sources in a country that also was one-party state for 16 years under a huge Castro and Cuba's influence and dominance.
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. One of the world's largest news organizations has just issued a directive to its journalists on the use of a new term that has crept into the political lexicon: alt-right. The Associated Press news agency, through its vice president in charge of standards, John Danishevsky, says that reporters using the term should consider providing context and describe its association with racist beliefs. Avoid using the term generically and without definition, Danishevsky wrote in a memo to AP staff. The term may exist primarily as a public relations device to make its supporters' actual beliefs less clear and more acceptable to a broader audience. The new guidelines come just weeks after President-elect Donald Trump appointed Steve Bannon as his chief strategist. Bannon ran Breitbart News, an outlet that he has described as the platform of the alt-right. 3 years ago, AP made headlines when it changed its approach to some other loaded terms, such as illegal immigrant, and revised the use of the word Islamist, disassociating it with the journalistic shorthand used to describe Islamic militants. A television channel in Morocco has had to mount a damage control operation after it aired a bizarre segment on how women can conceal the signs of domestic violence with makeup. The program is called Sabahiyat and is broadcast on the state-owned Channel 2M. Producers had a model on set who looked swollen and bruised, who was then attended to by a makeup artist. The segment left many viewers outraged. Hundreds have since signed a petition demanding that the country's broadcast regulator take action against the channel. No woman should ever have to live through domestic violence, one viewer said, let alone consider covering up its traces. Shame on you, 2M. The channel has since removed the program from its website and has issued what it called a clarification, which sounded more like an apology, calling the segment an error in judgment. 6 journalists in Tajikistan, all associated with the US-funded Radio Free Europe, have had their press cards revoked, and the government there has yet to offer an explanation. Radio Free Europe operates under Radio Ozodi in the capital, Dushanbe. On November the 25th, Ozodi posted an article on its site saying that President Emomali Rahman's daughter had been given an official role at the Tajik Foreign Ministry. The story listed other members of the Rahman family holding high governmental positions. When a state official then reportedly ordered the station to take the story down and the station refused, the 6 reporters lost their accreditation. Radio Ozodi, whose website isn't even accessible in Tajikistan since the government banned it, says the reporters affected had nothing to do with that story. Robert Mahoney from the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists said barring journalists from doing their work as retaliation for their employer's publication of a news item will not bury the news, but will call further attention to it, which it just did. Last month, after a year of drafting, amending, and a good deal of arguing, the British government finally passed a new law dealing with surveillance and national security. The Investigatory Powers Bill, or IPB, immediately attracted the attention of Edward Snowden, the former NSA contractor, who tweeted from Moscow saying that the IPB legalizes the most extreme surveillance in the history of Western democracy. Sounds like a story that the British news media could really sink their teeth into, but it didn't turn out that way, even though journalists have a rather large stake in this story. Over the past decade and a half, ever since 9/11, British reporters have been subject to stop and search requests from the police, mining of their digital data, secret monitoring of their communications, and a handful of reporters somehow ended up on the same databases that police use to track extremists. This new law legalizes measures such as those that have been used up until now on an ad hoc basis, and it does much more than that. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now on the UK's new Surveillance Act and the relationship between the security state and the journalists trying to cover it.
These were some of the headlines that surfaced online the day Britain's surveillance law was passed by the government. As for the British papers, which are seldom shy with their opinions, only one of them, The Independent, covered the story within the first 24 hours. Given the controversial content of the Investigatory Powers Bill, or IPB, particularly for journalists, where was the coverage?
When it finally passed, it seemed like everyone was kind of asleep. I was a little bit later to the story. We did it over the weekend. I was thinking, you know, what new information can I bring to this if everybody else has already covered it? But turned out, you know, there were just a couple of places. So Wired UK had done an in-depth piece and The Independent had followed it. But other than that, there was no coverage from broadsheets.
The journalistic shorthand for the bill is the Snoopers Charter. But the government rejects the implication, arguing that the legal changes will provide intelligence and law enforcement agencies with the powers they need to fight terrorism and investigate crime. David Omand is the former director of GCHQ, the communications headquarters of the UK's intelligence and security setup.
GCHQ will be perfectly entitled to obtain that metadata if they had sufficient purpose.
He is one of the few so-called securocrats in Britain, prepared to go on the record in defence of what he calls necessary and proportionate counter-terrorism measures relating to journalists.
I gave evidence to the different committees of the House of Commons. I couldn't find any gaps. The most important thing is not what's on the face of the Act, it's the code of practice. That explains in plain English what the authorities are allowed to do and what they're not. So I think it's much clearer for anyone who is worried about whether the state is going too far.
I find the IPB petrifying. It expands the powers drastically. It expands hacking powers of the police and of the intelligence agencies, it expands mass surveillance powers. And journalists are not given any specific protections under any of those new laws. So while the intention may have been to make the law clearer, in fact what we're seeing is a huge expansion of powers and no expansion of protection.
The prospect of unfettered state access to everything by human agents, malware planted in your mobile phone, malware planted in your computer, systematic surveillance, and automatic networking of everyone you're in touch with is absolutely terrifying. And one uses this analogy hesitatingly from the point of view of a Gestapo or a Stasi. It's a dream come true.
That kind of language from critics, comparisons to Nazi Germany and Soviet-era security states, is usually enough to get the media's attention. And for a time it did. When the law was in the drafting stages, there was plenty of news coverage. Two things have since changed. Back then, the minister in charge of security was Theresa May. She now leads the government as Prime Minister. And the official opposition, the Labour Party, which wanted changes in the original legislation, succeeding with some, coming up short on others, has since descended into a state of disarray over its own leadership. It seemed to lose interest in the issue, and with that, so too did the media.
Labour didn't push back at all in this final round, and whatever they'd asked for previously, some of it had been adopted, but most of it was still kind of a gaping hole. But because of their own internal politics and internal confusion, they hadn't really been paying attention to this. And I mean, I don't know if it's true that the media only cover things because there's political opposition, but there wasn't any controversy or a strong enough controversy around it in this final debate, which is why, you know, papers didn't lead with it.
Yeah. So you got here like BBC question time.
But the IPB may have more troubling implications for journalists than it does for politicians. Jason Parkinson is already dealing with some of them. Parkinson is a British freelance video journalist who has been covering protest and documenting dissent for more than 10 years.
It's for your own safety!
He has all kinds of stories of journalists being intimidated, harassed, assaulted, even put under surveillance by special teams deployed by UK police forces, specifically to gather intelligence.
Can you do me a favour and turn that off, please, now?
It was starting to become very, very difficult for me to actually even get to a job where there was going to be police and police intelligence, because I would routinely be stopped.
Section 1 of PACE gives me the power to keep you here, to detain you for the purpose of the search.
A lot of the time it was just stop and account, sometimes it was stop and search. Around 2007 I think there was 21 to 23 stops.
Well, you've got the choice, OK? You either go away now or you spend the rest of the afternoon yourself. What do you want to do?
I always thought, even back in 2007, there's something going on here, and it's taken nearly 10 years of suspicion to actually now find out that there was something going on. Information has been held and retained, and these officers and these units know who we are, know who we're talking to, and know what we're doing.
Parkinson and 5 of his colleagues are in the process of taking legal action against Scotland Yard, challenging the police's right to collect and retain their data, asking the court to order their files be erased, and a policy established to protect all journalists from future state surveillance. The case has been running for 2 years. And now, for the first time, the IPB details that the security services will be able to go even further, hacking into computers, networks, mobile devices, servers, and more. In justifying the introduction of the bill back in November 2015, the Conservative government asked an independent reviewer to scrutinise more than 65 different pieces of existing terrorism legislation. The bill's advocates say it now brings together all relevant surveillance measures under one law, overarching and transparent.
You just have to get the mechanics right. And so the public's got to have confidence that if it gives these powerful tools and the legal authority to the police and intelligence agencies, it will be used responsibly. And so you've got to have some kind of oversight the public trusts. You've got to be certain that when powers are used, they are used responsibly.
What is being said to the public and Parliament in Britain right now is trust us, trust the judges, trust the system. And many people want to. But what we have seen from the record is that over the period of 30, 40 years, they cannot be trusted.
And that lack of trust could be one reason why a petition demanding further debate of the IPB gathered more than 140,000 signatures. But with royal assent being granted this past week, the Investigatory Powers Bill now has the official stamp to be codified into law. As it stands, the extensive surveillance powers will come into force at the beginning of 2017.
Journalists are really feeling the effects of mass surveillance. I think that its impact will probably be long-term, and we'll only really come to realise the implications of building this surveillance society, looking back in 10, 15 years' time and trying to understand why we didn't have as many investigatory journalists out there, why we didn't have as many exposés, why we didn't have as many whistleblowers, why we didn't have as many sources coming forward. I think that those are really the tangible impacts that we're going to see in the long term.
And finally, we end where we began, with the media's coverage of the passing of a leader who was such a large presence in the lives of Cubans that many of them didn't even refer to Fidel Castro by name, preferring to use the term "quien tú sabes," you know who. And among those in mourning these days, regardless of their ideologies, are the world's political cartoonists, because nobody gave them as much material to work with than the cigar-smoking, gun-toting, tank-riding Castro. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.